Exactly. We were the first.
Hey, everyone. Great. Welcome back to Senate Education. Last year, the legislature passed a bill that started a process mandating schools be tested for PCBs. We had done lead testing maybe 2 years prior to that, working on that issue, and then PCBs. We started this process a little bit last year, and what we've asked Ms. Capolino and Ms. Briggs Campbell to talk about is where things are at, and feel free, of course, if you'd like to back up and tell us a little bit how we got here and the legislation. So with that, thanks so much, both of you, for being with us.
So it looks like most of you might have the presentation.
We do
that
all
I
have the
sent
presentation.
over. So I'm going to go over how we got to where we are and then where we are, and then I'll open it up for all of the questions that you have. So we'll start with, what are PCBs, just so you understand the context of this chemical. So they are a group of human-made chemicals that were commonly used in building materials and electrical equipment before 1980. They were used in caulks, paints, glues, plastics. I like to say, think of the building product that you would like to see stay elastic, and it was added to that to keep the elasticity there. And then also used in fluorescent lighting ballasts, transformers, and capacitors, mostly for their electrical insulating properties. So wide uses in everything. In 1979, the US EPA banned the use of PCBs. There's a lot of different ways we refer to PCBs, and just so that you understand, there's 209 different types of PCBs. So 209 single types of PCBs. They're called congeners. Monsanto took these different PCBs and they put them into their own separate mixtures to be used for all of the different uses I mentioned, and those are called aerophores. And that was Monsanto's brand name for the use of PCBs. And so when you look at what we report out and how we look at these, we compare them to aerophores. That's the type of sampling that we're doing at these schools. There also is a lot of discussion around units and measurements. I wanted to make sure I covered that also. So there's different ways to measure PCBs, and it's really by media. And so for indoor air, we measure PCBs as a nanogram per meter cubed, and that's a part per trillion. In water, we measure PCBs as a microgram per liter. That turns into a part per billion. And then for solids like soils and building materials, we measure it as a milligram per kilogram, which is a part per million. And so when we go from part per trillion, which is the smallest, up to a part per million, which is the largest, that's the way you should look at our measurements. So a part per trillion is really small. And what I say to most people when I'm talking to them about our standards and how we look at different ways of measurement is the smaller it is, it's usually the worse it is for you. And so we're measuring something that's really small, and it's also causes health issues. So I'm going to talk about that just for a second. So PCBs do cause serious health problems. The potential for health effects from PCBs, as with other chemicals, depends on how much, how long, and how often you're exposed to them. But numerous studies show that PCBs can cause effects to the nervous, immune, reproductive, and endocrine systems, and they are considered carcinogenic, so they can cause cancer, and they are also bioaccumulative in the environment, so they build up in fatty tissue and will persist for many, many years. So that is a quick 101 on PCBs. If we want to jump into how and why we're here, I heard you talking about Burlington High School, and that was really how everything started, and I'm happy to jump in and talk a little about Burlington High School, but I'm going to jump right into the legislation that happened after the findings at Burlington High School. And so we started in 2021, which was H439. Everything that you see on your PowerPoint or your printout that is not bolded came out of the 2021 legislative session. In 2022, there were some changes made, and that came in H740. And those changes were that we extended the date for the timeframe that schools needed to complete all the sampling to 2025. It was initially 2024. And then in the end, where there's the release language, It was changed from all buildings to public schools and approved and recognized independent schools. I did want to step back just for a second and explain why the release language is important, and it does tie into Burlington High School a lot. When all of the work started in Burlington, the Department of Environmental Conservation and the Department of Health really had no regulations on releases of PCBs in indoor air. Our release language is very specific to releases to the environment. So think about releases to groundwater, surface water, sediments, not indoor air from building materials. And so the release language is changed to allow for the Agency of Natural Resources to have some jurisdiction in regulating these releases to the environment now. And then in 2022, you'll see at the end that there was some funding provided to the Agency of Education to help assist where PCBs were identified in schools. So we started our program. There is a lot that the agencies and the specific agencies that are partnered on the school program, as the Agency of Natural Resources was given the direction to be the lead agency with assistance from Agency of Education and the Department of Health. So the three agencies have been working very closely to try and pull together a program. This is the only program in the nation right now that is sampling for PCBs in schools. One of my colleagues likes to say, therefore, it is the best program in the nation, and I like to keep it that way. But there's also a lot of interest in what we're doing, and I get frequent calls from other states that are also looking at this or finding this issue in their schools and looking for guidance from us. So back to our program, ANR Health and Agency of Education. The first thing we needed to do when legislation was passed was determine how we were going to prioritize the schools for sampling. So we put a survey out. We identified that there are 324 schools minus 40 that we're still waiting to respond. So 364 potential schools in the state that are built or renovated before 1980 that need to go through this process. We asked a lot of questions in the survey, basically construction dates if they knew it, whether or not there was any work that was going to happen, and we looked at the percentage of free and reduced lunch population within that school. Based on that information, we prioritized the schools to put them into timeframes for when we could move through the process to sample them. Looking at that, there is a schedule on our website that talks about which quarters of the year schools are expected to start their work. The next thing that we did was Agency of Natural Resources contracted with consultants, and that was the $4.5 million that the legislature gave us to do inventory and indoor air sampling. It's a two-step process that we have the consultants do. The first step is they go to the school and they do a full inventory of all the spaces in the school, and they identify all of the potential PCB containing materials that might be in those spaces. They take that information and they put them, the spaces into groups. Within the groups, we ask the consultant to sample 30% from each group. This has been proven to be very beneficial for us in identifying the specific sources and being able to carry that information into the other groups that are sampled and identifying those PCB sources.
Just out of curiosity, to put this in context, has this actually kicked off?
Yeah.
Have you started?
That'll be the final
Okay,
slide, I think. Part of this process also involved us having school action levels. So we needed to have a standard to be able to compare what our indoor air values were. And so on February 2nd, 2022, Agency of Natural Resources adopted interim standards that were given to us by the Department of Health. Those values are below there based on age. So for pre-K, it's 30 nanograms per meter cubed, the part per trillion, 60 nanograms per meter cubed, and 100 nanograms per meter cubed. After the indoor air sampling happens at the school, there's a joint letter that goes to the school that discusses what the results of the indoor air sampling was, and then provides occupancy options to the school so kids can stay in the spaces that they're learning in, or look at ways to reduce use of those spaces but continue to stay in classrooms. After we send the letter, we give the school 10 days to look at what the results are and make a decision on what occupancy option they want. We also schedule a meeting with them, with the three agencies, to go over the letter, make sure they understand it, and ask us any questions that they might have.
And if I can just interject really briefly, because all of the work that Trish has explained, the development of the standards, the inventory, the grouping, that this, all of those processes, that was the program that was outlined in statute, right? The testing, right? Everything that follows after you get the results, that's sort of what was not addressed in the legislation, right? So what do you do when you actually find PCBs has been something that DEC has been the lead on, with health and AOE providing support, but that's really had to be sort of invented whole cloth in the past 6 months or so, as we've really been engaging with schools and learning lessons as we've gone through. So it's been a tremendous kind of lift from the DEC team to develop this.
So are we in this alone, or is the federal government?
There's more.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
You understand,
I'm sorry.
you guys are really smart. Demanding. Right.
I'm sorry.
It's on
That's
the
a
next
good
page.
Okay. We
So
should read ahead.
You're that guy.
So when there are PCBs identified in the school, there are options that the schools have. The funding that AOE has now can assist with some of those options for mitigation to allow for students and staff to stay in the classroom. A lot of this work is also involved the programs, the agencies creating a lot of technical documents, FAQs. We've been having a lot of outreach meetings that have been spearheaded by AOE for us to try and make sure we're answering questions that superintendents and school officials have. And then the other thing is the development of a PCB database that we've created to allow for public access for all the information that we are gathering. And so once we do send that joint letter to the school, we have a 10-day clock for the school to get back to us. But after that 10 days, we also release the information publicly so that parents and caregivers can also look at that information. We have provided templates for the schools to provide a letter to their community before testing starts and after testing starts, to let them know what we're doing and what we found and what options are moving forward, and sending them to the database to find that information. So we are in constant communication with the United States Environmental Protection Agency that also has jurisdiction over PCBs. The EPA delegates a lot of programs. They have not delegated PCBs. And so there are certain crossovers where there is dual jurisdiction in this arena. And so we are working very closely with them to make sure that any outcomes, directions, and work that's done is aligned with both the state and federal requirements, so that there won't be any, hopefully no changes or different asks when we get to certain completion points. The other part of the work that we're doing is we were able to use funding from the Department of Health and from DEC, separate from the 4.5 million, to contract with the University of Iowa to help us work through different ways to identify PCBs in schools and remediate them. So there's the University of Iowa Superfund research program, and their whole program is based around sampling for PCBs in schools and looking at the research available for the best ways to measure and the best ways to remediate and mitigate. And so they've been a valuable resource for us throughout this process.
Senator Wood.
But just to get back to Senator Williams's earlier question, at least in Burlington, our situation did not come under a Superfund cleanup. And can you tell us why that is?
Maybe.
Partially or a little bit? Or?
So EPA has similar statutory provisions that we had. They do not address releases of contaminants in indoor air from building materials. And so it's not something that they could regulate. It is something that we've looked at with the EPA removals program to see if there could be some assistance, but their regulations don't allow for them to regulate releases of PCBs from building materials. If there were releases from the building to soil, to groundwater, to surface water, then there's a different ability from the EPA, but that is the main reason why.
So PCBs were in the soils, other areas, then it would be different.
Correct. At much higher concentrations. Yeah, they are. So as an example, there is a Superfund site in Bennington that is PCBs, only PCBs, and it's PCBs in groundwater and soil and sediment. And it's from a former manufacturer that manufactured capacitors, and the PCB oils leaked everywhere. So that is a Superfund site, but that is the reason why. It's really just the media and how the release occurred. So the last piece that I have on this is really that DEC is working closely with EPA, as I said, but a lot of our documents related to assessment. So what happens when there are PCBs detected in indoor air, there's a requirement to start looking for what those sources are, which goes back to the inventory and how we've set up the sampling process, and then how to actually clean up the PCBs. And we're making sure that our documents and directive are aligned with EPA on those pieces. That's where most of the EPA regulations start to come in. So that's the program that we've built and the general process and how it's working. So where are we? What have we done? How does it look right now? I think is the other question you probably want to hear from me. So I mentioned that there are 324 schools minus 40 that we're still waiting for. To date, we've looked at 58 or created 58 approvals for inventories to start in the schools. We've approved up to 39 schools for indoor air sampling right now. The number of schools where one sample has exceeded the school action level is 6. The number of schools where there's an exceedance of the immediate action level, and I didn't talk about that, but we have the school action level. We asked the Department of Health to give us a number that basically says that at or above this number, you should not be in that space anymore. So an emergency action number, immediate action level. So there's 2 locations there. And then a number of schools where the results have been below the school action level is 15. The table I have underneath that for you to see is really where we are with our ability to keep up with what we projected. So I mentioned we put schools into quarters for sampling and basically said if you need to start your process within this quarter. So we were able to achieve everything we needed to for the first 2 quarters. The last quarter, which is October to December 31st, there are 7 schools that didn't start within that quarter. And so we're going to be reaching out to the consultants in the schools to make sure that we can get them moving so that we can put that as a 0 also.
I think I missed this when you were talking, I'm sorry, but SAL, that's safe action level, school action level.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and that's the 30, 60, 100, the values that health created for us.
And
And
that
so,
means you have to do something.
okay, so you have to, so that 6 number means you have to do something, but that 2 means you have to do something immediately.
Correct.
Okay.
It means that space can't be used until you can
Can't be
reduce
used.
that concentration.
But those 6 schools can use their space, but they have to actively do something.
They have to actively do something, and then it goes back to the occupancy option. So based on what occupancy option the school chooses,
Mhm.
depends on whether or not they can use their space fully, or if they're going to reduce the amount of time in that space, or if they're not going to use that space at all. And that's part of what the joint letter from Health and A&R says when it goes to the school. Here are your options. Let's talk about what they mean, which one works best for your school.
Thank you.
And-
Senator Williams.
Well, do they actually have, the state do the testing, or do you have private firms to do it?
We contracted with 6 different environmental consultants to do this work.
So is that adequate number to do it? Is that putting a constraint on time?
There are definitely some things that we've identified as time constraints. Some of it is the consulting community. I think, I don't know what's happened with our labor right now, but everyone's facing labor shortages. My program's facing labor shortages. That hasn't been the reason for this, but it's certainly an amazing amount of work happening with our environmental consultants. And this is just one more thing that we've added to it. There were definitely some major delays that we had with the labs that we were using, and we were able to work out most of those issues also. So I'm hoping we're on the right path to completing the work that we said we'd do. But those are definitely the hurdles we faced in the
There's a
beginning.
very limited number of labs that do this, right?
4 labs that do this in the
National.
country.
Or-
Yeah.
And I just want to add a little bit more. So the do something here, if you're above the school action level, the sort of next steps, once you're above that school action level, you're within the DEC regulatory framework, right? And so there's some really clear steps that need to be taken. We try to do what we call a pregame huddle with folks that are going to be testing and sort of outline like what are your roles and responsibilities, what are the requirements that you need to meet. But obviously, one of the first steps is to try to identify the source, right? And once you know the source of the PCBs, then DEC provides that technical support, as does the consultant, in what are the strategies that you can and activities that you can undertake. And some of those might be mitigation strategies. So strategies that you're going to do on a temporary basis to reduce the amount of PCBs in the air. And we're trying to always balance that health and sort of safety risk versus keeping students in school for in-person instruction, right? Having within the context of the pandemic, that educational impact is really critical. So those are some strategies that may be undertaken, and it might be things like wet washing or cleaning out vents or covering up with special paints. And then remediation, I've learned all these technical terms from Trish over the last year. I'm very proud of myself. Remediation is the permanent removal. And so that may come quite a bit later, depending on, what the scope of the problem may be. And so those are like the, you said, okay, school action level, what does that mean? It means you have to do something. And these are some of the things that you may be doing. And that would also play with your occupancy of that space. If you are taking immediate action to lower the amount of PCBs within your air, then it would be safe for students and staff to remain in that space. But if you are not going to be able to take those steps, then maybe you need to reduce the amount of time that students are spending in that space. Maybe you have additional space that you can, instead of doing music class in that room, maybe you can do music class in this room. So working with the schools on those kind of logistic and operational considerations is part of why we have 3 agencies involved and really close contact with the schools to make these decisions.
Senator Bullock.
I swear you're reading my mind. I don't know how you do that, but so the 2 schools that exceed the IAL, I'm assuming they're included in the 6 that exceeded the SAL. Is that a total of 6 schools rather than 8?
It's the exceedances of the IAL were actually in ancillary spaces. So they were like closet spaces that exceeded the school action level. So we still use the lowest age that's in the school. So if it's a pre-K, then 30 is that lowest age and 90 is the IAL for that. And we have some exceedances that are in closet spaces, storage spaces. So it's still an exceedance of the IAL, but it doesn't really change what has to happen in the school right away because it's not fully occupied all the time. We're still working with the school to address the issue.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Senator Williams.
How do we budget for this?
Which part?
Oh, well, for the whole thing. I mean, we don't know what we don't know.
Right.
So is there someplace, obviously there's some federal funding available? No? So this is out of high.
Senator Weed.
So more specifically, in James, in your budget, there's no line item covering any. Yeah. But the testing is fully funded. Is that correct? I mean, the testing has been funded from previous.
There's 4.5 million, depending on how well that moves forward. It may or may not cover all of the work that needs to happen.
Well, there is some money.
Yeah, so I can speak a little bit to this. So just putting some brackets around this, you have a report coming from the secretaries from ANR and AOE, and Secretaries Moore and French will be speaking to this. So in some sense, I'm going to defer to them. But here's our context: is that in the last session, as part of the Ed Fund surplus, $32 million was identified for PCB mitigation and remediation, but of that funding, only 2.5 million was made available, essentially to respond to immediate needs that were happening over the past year. And a funding proposal is required of AOE and ANR, which you should have kind of any minute now, or today at some point, hopefully, for what to do with the bulk of the funding. So the 2.5 million is, in the bank for the Agency of Education. It did require that AOE and ANR go in front of the emergency board, which we did in October, with a sort of proposal for how to use those funds. And they're very specific uses. So those funds can be used at an 80-20 cost share. So 80% on the state, 20% on the district or the independent school. I always want to remind us that independent schools are also part of this picture. And specifically for DEC approved costs, that's our control, right? They're in a regulatory framework now. So when they have these costs, they have to be approved by DEC, and then that way AOE knows it's okay to pay the check, right? We're not experts on this. For costs associated with the like the development of a work plan by the consultant, source material testing, right? So we know it's in the air, but we've got to find out what the source of it is. And then mitigation strategies. Specifically, we cannot use any of those funds for permanent removal or remediation of the PCBs. So to date, we have 2 schools that have incurred costs. One of them has a fully DEC approved work plan and the other is sort of underway. And frankly, I was working on it today. I'm in the process of building out the grant. It's a reimbursement grant. The school knows what they'll be reimbursed for, so there's no issue right now. We haven't paid any cost to date, but we do know that we will. So the remainder, the big bulk of it, the 32 million, you'll receive a funding proposal on that, and I'm sure you'll have comments and questions at that point, but you can ask them like the secretaries.
Senator Williams?
So there's no remediation funding authorized. Is that because we're doing this in phases?
It's because that's how the legislation was written.
Oh.
So yeah, but I will say that where we're at with this is that the soonest that we would be expecting remediation activities to be taking place, which would probably be Cabot School, will be this summer. So right now, the schools that are above the school action level are identifying sources, coming up with mitigation activities to keep students in those spaces safe. So we're in what I would call sort of the bridge, the holding pattern until the permanent removal can happen.
How are families responding to the letters? You're at home, you get a letter, your school has PCBs in it. What are you hearing and seeing?
We're getting a minimal amount of questions.
Okay.
Not a lot of questions.
Okay. So the letter must be
And where
pretty
we've seen,
comprehensive.
yeah, I mean, I think that the big question is, do we have another Burlington at this point? And the answer is no, not so far.
Would you email a draft to Hayden of the letter just so we can see it? And we'll share it with them?
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think we're getting those kind of questions from parents.
No.
They're asking us specifically some health related questions that go to health. And some questions maybe around reduction and what's being done, but not a large amount of.
People aren't pulling their kids.
No, and where we've seen in the spaces themselves, so I think Cabot's a good example. We've had PCDs in the gym and in the art room. And at Danville School, they've been in some of those ancillary spaces. So the school was able to respond. They were able to keep pre-K kids out of the art space in the gym. During one period, it was, all students were out of the gym for a bit, and then it was established that it was safe for them to be in the gym. So we haven't had a situation where the whole school was impacted. It's been particular spaces. And the schools, I think, by and large, have done an excellent job. They know their communities well, and they're communicating really clearly with them and saying, this is where we're at in this process, right? And I think as long as there's movement forward.
Senator Gulick and Senator Weeks.
A couple of things. Can you tell us which 2 schools are benefiting from that 2.5 million? I think one is Cabot.
Cabot, and it will most likely be Oak Grove once they have a DEC approved work plan.
And then can you just to give us context, because I think maybe one of the reasons you're not getting a lot of letters is that you really are Vermont takes care of its people, or at least tries, and your levels are fairly conservative and people feel relatively safe. And I was just wondering if you could give us a comparison of like what the national level is nationwide, or like, because I've heard numbers thrown around, and same thing with the EU. I've heard like the EU has a number. I was just curious if you could share that with us. Or if it's not that simple, it might not be that simple.
I'm afraid to give you a wrong number. There is a document out that was from the University of Iowa where they've done a lot of work just providing information on what that background value is. And I just don't have it at the top of my head, so I can't give that to you right now.
But so the University of Iowa, that's probably a public document that if we wanted to look at, we
I'm
could.
happy to send it to you
Okay,
or to
that'd be
this
great.
committee.
Thanks.
So certainly a great effort. I'm curious, though, kind of the risks from the past, like lead, radon, asbestos. Do we feel comfortable that we're beyond that? Is that kind of a fair assessment, that we recognize those at the time and we move beyond, and it's
Radon testing is actually another piece of statute from 2021.
2021.
Yeah, all schools are required to test for radon by June of 2025. That doesn't belong to any particular agency. No agency was assigned that or has oversight over it, so the schools are just sort of required to do it.
okay.
So the answer on radon is we don't know what's out
It's
there.
in progress.
In progress, and I would say
It's fair.
in infancy.
Okay.
I would
Your
say-
question's a good one. I mean, in part,
Yeah.
it's, so then what's gonna be next?
Right.
I thought we had just to interject here, a complete school inventory at one point that was being done, or is,
Yeah, so this is.
that was
part of-
looking at almost everything, or was
Well-
it more the building?
It's the building. This is part of Act
Yeah.
72,
Okay.
which will not surprise you. I'm always happy to come in and chat
Yeah.
about and leading that work as well. And so we did a self-reported facilities inventory last year, and the comprehensive facilities assessment is underway right now, and the work will be completed by October of this year. But it's not testing for radon, it's not testing for PCBs, it's the facilities condition itself.
So when you say assessment, you're talking about this square footage of this type of room, or?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
looking at the age and condition of all major systems, looking at the capacity to deliver 21st century education, looking at any upcoming major construction. And it's all being driven towards sort of the end result of Act 72, which was an omnibus facilities bill. The end result is to have a clear understanding of what our kind of facilities debt is, since we have had a moratorium on state spending on school construction and facilities since 2008. And then also to be able to guide school districts in making 5-year capital investment plans.
We'll look at Act 72 next week when we have key check-in also, and also hopefully our federal delegation can help us with some of this. I think Rebecca Ellis from Peter Welch's office hopefully can join us. And just know that this is something we're facing, but everybody in the country is going to be facing. Please, Senator.
Just a general question.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll get answered later, but so this legislature will pass a bill, not assign responsibility to an agency, and not assign a budget item?
Are you talking about the radon?
Yeah,
Yeah.
any.
You know, the radon thing is a good question. I think what we asked for, and we can go back and take a look, is, basically in 5 years, give us a report what those radon numbers look like. I think those numbers would also go to the superintendents and others so they can act on them, but we'll follow up and see. Your point's a good one, and it's well taken, that it did surprise me a little bit that the work is being done, and we might have to, like, for
And it's
example, you
this-
could test today.
Yeah.
Radon could be high and the solution could be easy and nobody's acting on it, so.
And the schools are the ones that have the responsibility to do the testing and staff.
No, right, I understand, but to Senator Williams' point, I think, when can we start to see these numbers? What are some of the things happening?
Yeah.
If somebody does have a question, who do they call up and say, hey, our radon numbers are off the chart? We've heard that it can be easy as ventilation, when it can be much more serious? Good question. Please, anything else?
My big question is if Jill got her scarf back.
Oh, right, it's over there.
It's over there.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
We were really worried about that.
Oh, thank you. I lose more scarves. As soon as I put it on, I think I'm losing that.
School construction is going to be a big part of, our conversations this session, without a doubt. And how can we help districts with some of these funding issues? And Act 72, so it's not only, some bricks and mortar kinds of things, but are these 21st century institutions that kids can really.
It includes an energy audit, a two-year
Yeah.
energy audit as well. It's a pretty comprehensive
Yeah.
assessment.
When will we get that?
You should have, all the reports will be completed by October of 2023. And then we'll have a legislative report in January of 24 with like big ticket numbers.
Okay.
Let's say that just requiring AOE, A&R and health to work together on the PCB piece, it definitely has put us into a better relationship. Not that we had a bad one, but a closer relationship with AOE, but it does allow for where there is construction work to happen to be, aligned with some of the PCB work that needs to happen and potentially any of the other work that would be lead paint, asbestos, and address it all at once while the school is under construction so that you don't have to go back and do it later. So there's definitely more coordination happening around the needs of the school and how to create a better environment.
And I've certainly seen in my community, also in Hoosick Falls, uptick in cancer rates, from PFAS, things like that. I can even think of some personal experiences when family members grew up on Lake Champlain on the other side, when they would go swimming in those, right through those paper mills when they were kids. And, come 72, late 60s, damn, it just seems, and this is my just anecdotal, not scientific, but these are serious things.
And certainly I would echo what Trish is saying. Other states are paying attention here. So I think we're on the leading edge,
Yeah.
which means we're bearing the cuts and bruises of it, but we do good work in the state. So
And I think it's as kids are developing. I mean, my age, I'm not sure how much, if I got exposed to PCBs now, what have I got? Would you say 20 years left? 40, yeah. But if you're little, that's where, you get impacted. Yeah. So.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, sounds like Senator Kulik's done. Anybody else?
I thought she should
No, that was great. That was great. Anything else? Thanks.
All right,
Seriously.
thank you.
All right. Okay, committee, certainly certain things are coming to the forefront that we'll be working on. School construction is one of them. And as I think this Teaching Vermont campaign, House will send us a bunch of things.
That's
but
exciting.
yeah,
I like
I
that.
think there are a bunch of things that are bubbling up.
That's cool.
So we're adjourned for today. We look forward
I know,
to
but
seeing
we want to
everybody.
stay here and hang out for a little bit.
Yeah.